And for today's activity, we are going to be dissecting a pig's heart to identify the parts and to learn about the different parts and functions of the pig's heart, which is used as a model as it is very similar to the human heart. But before we proceed to the activity, let us first wear our surgical gloves and our safety goggles.
First, let us examine the orientation and external structure of the heart. This surface is the ventral or anterior view of the heart. That means it is superficial to the chest. You can also recognize this by the groove that extends from the right side of the broad end diagonally to a point above and to the left of the apex. And then this surface right here is the dorsal or posterior view of the heart. That means it is superficial to the back. Let us now examine the heart's external structure. The thin membrane or the pericardium is located in this part. You can kind of pull them. This thin membrane right here that I'm holding is the pericardium. When we carefully remove this thin tissue, we'll be able to see the myocardium or what is called the muscle of the heart. This myocardium is located below the two atriums and is referred to as the left and right ventricles. We can kind of cut this part so we can see the muscle. And when we go down on the bottom of the left ventricle, we can see the apex. This part or tip right here is the apex. The next thing that we are going to do is to identify the four chambers of the heart from the anterior surface. Therefore, we put the heart down on the dissecting pan where the ventral side is facing us. This part right here is the left atrium. This part is the one who receives the oxygenated blood from the upper and lower extremities. Remember that the left side of the heart receives the oxygenated blood and the right side of the heart receives the unoxygenated blood. And just below the left atrium is the left ventricle. We'll see later that this has the thickest muscle out of all the four chambers because its function is to distribute the blood to the systemic circulation, which requires a lot of work, therefore requires a bigger muscle. This left ventricle is the largest out of four chambers. This part is the right atrium. This is the part where it receives the unoxygenated blood given by the vessel called the coronary sinus. The blood is given by the superior and inferior vena cava. And just below the right atrium is the right ventricle. This is the part where it pushes the unoxygenated blood to the lungs. We will also observe later that the muscle on this ventricle is less large than the left ventricle because it only pushes the blood to its closest organ, which is the lungs, and therefore does not need much work and muscle. Now that we are done locating the four chambers, we are now going to identify the blood vessels of the heart. Now there are three blood vessels, the veins, arteries, and capillaries, but we'll deal mostly with the artery and veins. This part right here is the pulmonary trunk or pulmonary artery. This is the only artery that carries unoxygenated blood. It brings unoxygenated blood from the right ventricle to the lungs. If you push down your probe through this artery, it leads you to the right ventricle. And then, behind the pulmonary artery is the aorta. It is a major vessel near the right atria and just behind the pulmonary artery, and the curved part of this is known as the aortic arc. And this supplies the blood to the upper body. These long branches are called the coronary artery. This originates from the base of the aorta and this supplies blood to the heart muscle. This is the pulmonary vein. It brings blood to the left atrium and it is the only vein that carries oxygenated blood that comes from the lungs. When you flip the heart over to the posterior side, you'll see the superior and inferior vena cava. The superior vena cava leads directly to the right atrium. These are the superior and inferior vena cava. These is located on the left side of the heart and are connected to the right atrium. As you can see, the superior vena cava is just above the right atrium and the inferior vena cava is just below the right atrium. Now that we are done with the external structure, let us now locate the parts of the internal heart. The first step, use the scissors to cut through the side of the pulmonary artery and continue cutting down into the wall of the right ventricle. Be careful to just cut deep enough to go through the wall of the heart chamber. Your cutting line should be above and parallel to the groove of the coronary artery. With your fingers, push open the heart at the cut to examine the internal structure. If there is dried blood inside the chambers, rinse out the heart. Locate the right atrium. Notice the thinner muscular wall of this receiving chamber. Find where the inferior and superior vena cava enter this chamber and notice the lack of valves. Locate the valve between the right atrium and right ventricle. This is called the tricuspid valve. This valve allows blood flow from the right atrium into the right ventricle during diastole. Diastole is the period when the heart is relaxed. When the heart begins to contract, or also known as the systole phase, ventricular pressure increases until it is greater than the pressure in the atrium, causing the tricuspid to snap closed. Use your fingers to feel the thickness of the right ventricle and its smooth lining. Also note the network of irregular muscular cords on the inner wall of this chamber. Find the septum on the right side of the right ventricle. This thick muscular wall separates the right and left pumping ventricles from each other. Inside the right ventricle, locate the pulmonary artery that carries blood away from this chamber. Find the one-way valve called the pulmonary valve that controls blood flow away from the right ventricle at the entrance to this blood vessel. Using your scissors, continue to cut open the heart. Start a cut on the outside of the left atrium downward into the left ventricle, cutting toward the apex to the septum at the center groove. Push open the heart at this cut with your fingers and rinse out any dried blood with water. Examine the left atrium. Find the openings of the pulmonary veins from the lungs. Observe the one-way semilunar valves at the entrance to these veins. Inside this chamber, look for the valve that controls blood flow between the upper left atrium and lower left ventricle. This valve is called the bicuspid or mitral valve. This valve consists of two leaflets and blood flows from the left atrium into the left ventricle during diastole. Examine the left ventricle. Notice the thickness of the ventricular wall. This heart chamber is responsible for pumping blood throughout the body. And using your scissors, cut across the left ventricle toward the aorta and continue cutting to expose the valve. Let us count the 3 flaps or leaflets on this valve leading from the left ventricle into the aorta and note their half-moon shape. This is called the aortic valve. And again, using scissors, cut through the aorta and examine the inside. Find the hole or coronary sinus in the wall of this major artery. This leads into the coronary artery, which carries blood to and nourishes the heart muscle itself.
And that's it for our activity for today. I hope you learned about the different parts and about the different functions and where they are connected with each other. So there you go, dissecting the pig's heart. Thank you so much and goodbye.